My mom chose her new family over me and kicked me out, but she forgot one thing. Hello, read it? I was never meant to be a guest in my own home. The walls of that house held my childhood. Every inch of it, every scratch on the floors, every faded mark on the walls told a story, my story. It was the place where I took my first steps, where I lost my first tooth, where I sat on the living room floor with my dad, helping him fix things he probably could have done faster alone, but let me be a part of anyway. My mother used to say that no matter what happened in life, family came first, that this house wasn't just a building, but a testament to everything we had built together. She used to say a lot of things. My name is Alex, and I'm 27 now. I've lived through things that changed the way I see people, things that took the foundation I thought I had and cracked it wide open. If you had asked me years ago where I'd be today, I would have said somewhere stable, somewhere I belonged. But belonging is an illusion when the people you trust the most are the first to push you out. My father passed away when I was 15. It happened fast. One moment, he was there, and the next, he was a framed picture on the mantel, a collection of memories slowly fading into things only I seem to remember. Losing him shattered everything. My mother, who had always been the strongest person I knew, turned into someone I barely recognized. She was still there, physically, but there was an emptiness in her, a hollow space that nothing seemed to fill. For a while, it was just the two of us, figuring things out, surviving. I thought we were getting through it together, but looking back, I think she was just waiting for something or someone to take the weight off her shoulders. And that someone came when I was 19. His name was Rick. Rick wasn't like my dad. Where my father had been steady and patient, Rick was loud and overbearing. The kind of man who made every room feel smaller when he walked into it. He had 2 kids of his own, a boy and a girl, both younger than me. My mother met him through work, and before I knew it, he was in our house, his presence creeping into every corner of what used to be ours. At first, I tried to be understanding. My mother was happy again. At least, that's what I told myself. I was in college by then, juggling classes and a part-time job, so I wasn't home as much. Every time I came back, though, it felt like things had shifted slightly, like the air was heavier, like I was a visitor instead of a son. The changes started small. My room, the one I had grown up in, was suddenly reassigned to Rick's son. My things were packed into boxes without my permission, shoved into a smaller room at the back of the house. My seat at the dinner table was taken. I was expected to accommodate them, to adjust, to shrink myself to fit into a family that didn't seem to have space for me anymore. My mother didn't ask if I was okay with it. She acted as if it was natural, as if this was just how things were now. Rick wasn't just moving in, he was taking over. His voice became the loudest in the house. His decisions carried weight that mine never did. He had opinions on everything, from how I spent my money to how often I should visit. His kids followed his lead, treating me like I was the outsider, like I didn't belong in my own home. I could have fought back. Maybe I should have. But my mother had spent years telling me that family was everything, that love meant compromise, that I needed to be patient. So I was. But patience only works when people respect you. By the time I finished college, things had gotten worse. Rick and his kids had settled in completely, and I had been pushed further to the edges of what used to be my own life. My mother no longer looked at me with the warmth she once had. Instead, there was distance, a quiet expectation that I should make myself scarce. I had started working by then, saving up, planning for the future. I still believed that, in the end, my mother would always be on my side. I was wrong. The turning point came in small moments, disagreements that weren't really disagreements, just Rick making decisions for the household and my mother going along with it. Conversations where I was told I needed to be more considerate, more understanding, more willing to sacrifice for the good of the family. But whose family? It wasn't mine anymore. Eventually, my presence became an inconvenience. I was working full-time, supporting myself, contributing when I could, but it didn't matter. Rick made it clear that he saw me as nothing more than a burden, and his kids followed suit. My mother stopped standing up for me, stopped listening when I tried to tell her how I felt. It was like I had become an afterthought, a guest overstaying their welcome. Then one day I came home to find my things piled outside. Not just some of them, all of them. The sight of my entire life dumped onto the front lawn like garbage sent a numb shock through my body. Clothes, books, furniture, everything I owned, exposed to the world, discarded without a second thought. And when I looked up at the house, at the place that had once been my home, I realized something that had been creeping up on me for years. I wasn't part of this family anymore. I had been replaced. Everything my father had built, everything that was supposed to be mine, had been given away like it meant nothing. My mother had chosen them, her new family, over me. And just like that, I was gone. I moved into a small apartment, built my own life, and tried to forget the past. But forgetting isn't easy when betrayal runs this deep. For a long time, I told myself that none of it mattered anymore, that the house, the people, the memories, I didn't need any of it. Then, 2 weeks ago, everything changed. Moving out should have felt like freedom. That was what I told myself as I carried the last box up 3 flights of stairs to my tiny apartment. My arms burning, my muscles sore from hauling what little I had left of my life into a space that wasn't even half the size of my old bedroom. I told myself I was free as I collapsed onto a second-hand couch, staring at the ceiling while the empty silence pressed in from all sides. But freedom is an illusion when you never chose to leave. It wasn't my decision to walk away from my home, to be cast aside like a stray no longer wanted. I had spent 19 years inside those walls, every moment of my childhood woven into the foundation, only for it to be stripped from me by a man who had done nothing to earn the place he now called his own. And the worst part? My own mother had let it happen. I should have hated her, but I didn't. That was the problem. Even as I settled into my new life, waking up in a space that never felt like mine, eating dinners alone in a kitchen that smelled unfamiliar, I couldn't bring myself to erase her from my thoughts. For years, she had been my world, the one who bandaged scraped knees, who whispered reassurances in the dark when thunderstorms rattled the windows. The one who had once told me that no matter what, we would always be a family. And yet, when the time came to choose between me and them, she hadn't hesitated. That was the thought that kept me awake at night, staring at the chipped paint on the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment leading up to that day. The way Rick had smirked from the porch as my belongings sat in a pile on the lawn. The way his kids had watched from the window, their faces twisted with amusement. The way my mother had stood beside him, arms folded, eyes avoiding mine, as if she couldn't even bear to look at what she was doing. I told myself I was better off. I worked long hours, picked up extra shifts, anything to keep my mind busy. When I wasn't working, I was walking, endless loops around the city, through streets that never felt quite like home, drowning in the noise of strangers' conversations just to fill the emptiness in my own life. Time passed. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. Eventually, a year slipped by. The calls didn't start immediately. At first, there was nothing. No texts, no voicemails, no effort to reach out. She had moved on, and I forced myself to do the same. I stopped checking my phone as often, stopped waiting for some sign that she regretted what had happened. But then, slowly, they started coming. The first call was a shock. Her name flashing across my screen sent something sharp through my chest, a mixture of resentment and something I didn't want to name. I stared at it until it went to voicemail, unwilling to let her hear just how much her voice still affected me. I expected anger, maybe guilt, some kind of apology, even a half-hearted one. But when I played the message back, all I got was hesitation. A weak attempt at small talk. She asked how I was, how work was going. Her tone was careful, uncertain, as if she didn't know how to speak to me anymore, as if I had become a stranger. I deleted the message without responding, but the calls kept coming. At first, they were spaced out, weeks apart, then days. I never answered. I let them go to voicemail, listened in silence as she stumbled through the same empty words, never quite saying what she wanted to say. There was something behind her voice, something she wasn't telling me. I ignored it, until 2 weeks ago, when she left a message that made my stomach drop. She needed to talk about the house. I let the words sit in my mind for a long time before I did anything. The house. Not me. Not our relationship. Not the years of silence that stretched between us. Just the house. I called her back. The phone rang longer than I expected before she answered. I heard the hesitation in her breath before she even spoke. It was strange hearing her voice again after so long. It was thinner now, stretched like she was carrying something too heavy for too long. She didn't get to the point right away. Instead, she tried to fill the silence with meaningless questions. How was I? Was work going well? Had I been eating enough? The kind of things a mother should ask, but now they felt like an afterthought, like she was forcing herself to play the role she had abandoned years ago. I let her talk. I let her struggle through the conversation. Let her hear the weight of my silence, waiting for whatever had made her desperate enough to call. And then finally she said it. Rick had lost his job. It had happened fast. One day he was working, the next he wasn't. A layoff. Or at least that was the excuse he gave. She had been picking up extra shifts, but it wasn't enough. Bills were stacking up. His kids, now older but still just as entitled, hadn't adjusted their spending. Credit cards were maxed out, debt climbing faster than they could handle. And now, the house was in trouble. She said it like it was nothing, like it was just another problem to be solved. Like she wasn't talking about the place I had been forced to leave behind. For a long moment, I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just a cold, empty numbness. She was calling me now, after all this time, not because she missed me, not because she regretted what had happened, but because suddenly she needed something, because suddenly the son she had cast aside wasn't so expendable after all. But she had no idea just how much power I still had. She had never bothered to check, never asked what happened to the house, never wondered who still held the real control. Because despite everything, despite being kicked out and treated like an outsider, despite the years of silence, there was one thing she had never realized. I still owned the house, and she was about to find out exactly what that meant. There was a time when I would have dropped everything to help my mother. That version of me had died the night I was kicked out. After I hung up the phone, I sat in silence, staring at the blank wall of my apartment, her voice still echoing in my ears. It wasn't just what she had said, it was how she had said it. No apology, no acknowledgement of the years that had passed, just a thinly veiled request for help disguised as concern. She wasn't calling because she missed me. She was calling because she needed something. For a long time, I did nothing. I let the weight of it settle, let it sink in that after everything. After the years of being cast aside, I was still nothing more than a convenience to her, a last resort. And yet, a dark part of me was satisfied, because for the first time since they had thrown me away, she needed me. And she had no idea just how much I already knew. I had been watching from a distance, tracking the slow decline of the house I had once called home. I had seen the financial trouble creeping in, the unpaid property taxes, the overdue mortgage statements. They had been so sure of themselves, so sure that they could rewrite history and erase me from it. But they had never checked the paperwork. They had never bothered to see whose name was still on the deed. They had spent years living in my house, treating it like their own, believing they were untouchable. Now it was time to remind them of the truth. I spent the next few days reviewing every document I had, refreshing my memory on the legalities of the house, ensuring that when I walked through that door, there would be no doubt. No argument, no escape. And when the moment came, I didn't hesitate. The drive back felt surreal. It had been years since I had last seen that house, but every mile I drove brought back memories I had spent so long trying to bury. I could still picture my father standing in the yard, fixing the old fence that had long since rotted away. I could still hear my mother humming in the kitchen as she cooked dinner. I could still remember the way the house had once felt warm, safe, whole. Now it was just a shell. When I pulled into the driveway, the first thing I noticed was how much the house had deteriorated. The once pristine lawn was overgrown, patches of weeds creeping up along the walkway. The gutters sagged under the weight of neglect. The paint on the shutters was peeling, curling away from the wood like dead skin. The front porch, once a place of comfort, looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years, littered with empty bottles and cigarette butts. This wasn't my home anymore. It was a ruin. I stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of every step as I made my way to the front door. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. I pulled out my keys, the same keys I had never returned, and let myself in. The moment the door swung open, I was hit with the stale, suffocating scent of neglect. The air inside was thick with the stench of unwashed laundry, spilled beer, and something rotten that I didn't want to identify. The living room was a disaster zone. Dirty dishes stacked on the coffee table, crumbs and trash scattered across the floor, clothes draped over the furniture as if no one cared enough to put them away. It looked nothing like the home I remembered. And then I saw him, Rick, slouched in an armchair, a beer bottle dangling from his fingers, his gaze half-focused on the television. He looked different, bloated, unshaven, the kind of man who had long since given up trying. For a brief moment, he didn't even register that I was there. And then his eyes met mine. Confusion. Shock. Then anger. It was almost amusing to watch the emotions flicker across his face. The slow realization that I wasn't supposed to be here, that I had stepped back into a world he thought he had erased me from. He opened his mouth, but I didn't let him speak. I moved past him like he was nothing, my footsteps echoing through the house as I took in the wreckage of what had once been my life. Everywhere I looked, there was more evidence of how little they had cared. Family photos had been replaced with pictures of Rick's kids. My old room had been stripped of any trace of me, turned into a cluttered teenage wasteland of discarded clothes and forgotten belongings. Even the kitchen, once my mother's sanctuary, was filled with dirty dishes and the overwhelming scent of grease and neglect. They had taken everything, but they had no idea just how over it was. When I finally turned back to Rick, I saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He was waiting for me to explode, waiting for some kind of confrontation, some heated argument that he could twist in his favor. I didn't give him that satisfaction. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the documents I had brought with me. I dropped them onto the coffee table. The house was mine, legally, officially, undeniably. For the first time since I had walked in, Rick looked genuinely uneasy. He snatched up the papers, scanning them with furrowed brows, his face darkening with every passing second. He was trying to find a loophole, a way out. There wasn't one. When his gaze lifted back to mine, there was something else behind his anger now. Panic. Because for the first time since he had forced his way into my life, he realized that I wasn't just some kid he could push around. I was the one holding all the power now. And then, I heard footsteps. My mother appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes darting between me and Rick. She had heard everything. She knew. She had spent years pretending that none of this mattered, that I was just a disposable part of a past she wanted to forget. But now, she was standing face to face with the consequences of her choices. And she looked terrified. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. Because at that moment, as she stared at the documents on the table, at the undeniable proof of what she had never bothered to check, she finally understood. She had chosen the wrong side. And now it was too late. I had spent years carrying the weight of what they had done to me. The shame of being tossed out like garbage. The bitter sting of knowing I had been replaced. The suffocating loneliness of realizing that the person who had once called me family had chosen someone else over me without a second thought. But now, standing in the wreckage of what had once been my home, watching Rick's face shift from confusion to denial to sheer, unfiltered panic as he flipped through the legal documents in his trembling hands, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Control. For the first time since they had torn my life apart, I was the one holding the power. They had lived for years under the illusion that they were untouchable, that I had been erased so thoroughly from the picture that I could never come back to reclaim what was mine. They had assumed that silence meant surrender, that because I hadn't fought back immediately, I had accepted my fate. But they had no idea how long I had waited for this moment, how carefully I had prepared for the exact day when all their arrogance, all their entitlement, all their years of comfort at my expense would come crashing down around them. Rick's hands tightened around the paperwork, his face twitching with barely contained fury as his mind scrambled for a way to talk himself out of this. He was saying something, angry words thrown in my direction, denial slipping into every syllable. He was calling this a mistake, claiming my mother had given the house to him, acting as if his mere presence here had somehow rewritten legal ownership. But I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I let him rant because it didn't matter what he said. What mattered was what was written on those papers. what had been true from the very beginning. The house was mine. It had always been mine. My mother stood frozen near the doorway, her face pale, her lips slightly parted like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. She wasn't looking at Rick. She wasn't looking at the house. She was looking at me, really looking at me for the first time in years. And I could see it in her expression, the slow, creeping realization that she had never actually known the full extent of what she had done. For years, she had convinced herself that what happened was inevitable, that I had moved on, that I had let them take everything without a fight. She had never once considered that I might be waiting, that I might be watching, that I might be coming back. But now, there was no more pretending, no more rewriting history to make themselves feel better about the choices they had made. I was here, and I was tearing down every lie they had built around themselves. Rick's voice was rising, his words sharper now, desperate in a way that was almost pathetic. He was threatening lawyers, calling this fraud, acting as if screaming loud enough could change reality. I watched as he turned to my mother, demanding that she do something, that she tell me I was wrong. But she didn't, because for the first time I think she truly understood how little say she had in this. She turned toward me then, and for a split second, there was something raw in her expression. Not just regret, but fear, because she knew that this wasn't just about the house. This was about everything, about every time she had ignored me, every time she had chosen them, every time she had looked away while I was pushed further and further out of my own life. She had spent years avoiding this reckoning, pretending it would never come, convincing herself that she could keep her new family without ever truly facing the cost of what she had lost. But now, she had to face it. Rick had stopped yelling. He was staring at the documents again, his brain working through the situation, his jaw tightening. He knew there was no winning this. That no matter how much he wanted to argue, the law was on my side. That if he pushed this, all he would be doing was making things worse for himself. The house was mine, and as of today, he was nothing more than an unwanted squatter. I let the silence hang for a moment before I spoke. My voice was calm, steady, as I laid out the reality of the situation. They had exactly 1 week to leave. 7 days to pack up their things and get out before I took legal action, before I had them removed by force, before I made sure they never set foot in this house again. And if they thought I was bluffing, if they thought for even a second that I would hesitate, they were about to learn just how serious I was. Rick exploded. The false bravado crumbled in an instant, rage spilling out of him like venom. He started pacing, his hands shaking, his voice rising to a full-blown rant. He was calling me ungrateful, accusing me of betrayal, throwing every insult he could grasp at in an attempt to make me the villain in his story. But none of it touched me, because no matter how much he wanted to rewrite the past, I remembered the truth. I remembered the night they kicked me out. I remembered the way he had smirked from the porch, arms crossed, watching as my things were tossed onto the front lawn like they were trash. I remembered my mother standing beside him, silent, indifferent, unwilling to meet my eyes. I remembered how easily they had discarded me. And now, it was their turn to be discarded. My mother tried to intervene, her voice softer than his, but laced with the same desperation. She asked if I really wanted to do this, if I really wanted to take away the only home they had, as if she hadn't done the same to me, as if she had any right to act like a victim now. She still thought I was the same person I had been back then, the one who would hesitate, the one who would let guilt hold him back, the one who would suffer in silence just to keep the peace. But that person was gone. I turned to her, and for the first time in years, I saw it click behind her eyes. The understanding, the quiet, sinking realization that she had made the wrong choice, that she had bet on the wrong person, that she had thrown me away for a man who had given her nothing but debt, who had hollowed out the home my father had built and turned it into something rotting from the inside out, that she had sided with a parasite, and now she was paying the price. I told her, in no uncertain terms, that this wasn't their home anymore, that they had given up that right the day they threw me out, that they had 1 week to pack up and leave, and if they weren't gone by then, they wouldn't like what happened next. And then I turned and walked out the door. Rick was still yelling when I left. My mother was still standing frozen, reality finally sinking in. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that for the first time in years, I was walking away on my own terms. They had 7 days. And once those 7 days were up, I was taking back everything they had stolen from me. Because this time, I was the one in control. 7 days came and went, and I knew they hadn't left. I had driven past the house more than once, watching from a distance, making sure they weren't trying to pull something at the last minute. The same cars were still in the driveway, the same blinds drawn over the windows, the same pathetic attempt at pretending everything was normal when they had to know deep down that time was running out. I wasn't surprised. People like Rick didn't believe consequences applied to them. They thought if they ignored the problem long enough, it would go away, that if they acted like they still owned the place, I would hesitate, back down, or even better, decide I didn't want the house after all. They were wrong. By the 7th night, I had everything prepared. The legal documents had been finalized. The eviction had been officially processed. If they weren't gone by morning, the police would be involved. I had spent years waiting for this moment, planning for it, making sure that when the time came, there would be no loopholes, no last-minute appeals, no chance for them to manipulate their way out. This was their last night in my house, whether they accepted it or not. When I arrived the next morning, I was met with the usual arrogance. Rick was standing in the yard, phone in hand, acting like he was dealing with a minor inconvenience rather than the end of his free ride. He barely looked up as I parked, choosing instead to mutter something under his breath while aggressively typing on his screen, probably trying to Google ways to fight an eviction that had already been legally approved. His son was on the porch, arms crossed, scowling like a brat who had just been told to clean his room. I ignored them both, walking straight to the door. My mother was inside, sitting at the dining table, staring at nothing, as if she had already accepted what was coming but was too proud to say it out loud. I told them they had an hour. That was it. No more extensions, no more fake delays, no more excuses. Rick scoffed, claiming he was calling a lawyer, that this was illegal, that I had no right to do this. But even as he spoke, I could see it in his face. The slow realization that his words meant nothing, that I wasn't reacting, that I wasn't playing into his usual power games. His voice was loud, aggressive, but there was an edge of panic beneath it, something desperate in the way he kept looking at my mother, waiting for her to say something, to step in, to take his side. But she didn't. She was quiet, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes flickering toward me every few seconds, filled with something I couldn't quite define. Rick started pacing, listing off reasons why he shouldn't have to leave, why this was unfair, why I was being cruel. He said they had nowhere else to go. He said I was making a mistake. He said my father would be ashamed of me. That one almost made me laugh. My father had built that house, poured his soul into every inch of it, had given my mother and me a home where we could feel safe. And this was what it had become? A wreck filled with debt, garbage, and entitlement? If my father had been here, he wouldn't have let it get this bad in the first place. He would have seen Rick for what he was. He would have protected me. But my mother hadn't. She had let it happen, let them take everything from me, and now, here she was finally watching it all fall apart. An hour passed, and they hadn't moved. I expected it. People like Rick never left quietly. They always thought if they made things difficult enough, they could force people to change their minds. He thought I would hesitate, that I would let emotions get in the way, that I would give in and let them stay. But he didn't understand. My emotions were the reason I was doing this. I made one call. That was all it took. 20 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up, followed by a locksmith. The officer was calm, professional, letting them know they had to vacate immediately or be forcibly removed. Rick lost it, shouting, throwing his arms in the air, demanding to know how this could be happening, as if he hadn't been warned, as if he hadn't brought this on himself. His son stormed back into the house, slamming doors, making a scene, trying to act like this was some great injustice instead of the inevitable consequences of their own actions. My mother stood slowly, staring at the officer, at me, at the house, as if she couldn't believe it had come to this. But it had. Rick tried one last time to fight it, his voice rising, calling me every name he could think of, but I wasn't listening anymore. The officer was firm, telling him he needed to leave, now, or be arrested for trespassing. That was when reality finally seemed to sink in. My mother didn't say a word as she went to gather her things. It took 2 more hours before they were gone. I stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching as they packed their car with everything they could fit. It wasn't much. They had wasted everything they had. Rick tried to get the last word, sneering that I would regret this, that I was pathetic, that I had ruined my own family. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because as he stood there, screaming at me, spitting insults like they had any weight left, I saw it. The defeat in his eyes, the understanding that he had lost, that he had never been anything more than a leech, feeding off what my father had built, what I had been meant to inherit. And now his meal ticket was gone. My mother hesitated before getting into the car. She looked at me like she wanted to say something, like she wanted to fix what couldn't be fixed. But there were no words that could undo what had been done. She had chosen them, and now she had to live with that choice. The moment they drove away, I turned and walked back into my house. It didn't feel like home. Not yet. It would take time to strip away the years of neglect, to remove every trace of them, to restore what had been taken. But I had time. I had patience. And now, I had justice. I moved through the house slowly, taking it all in, the walls, the floors, the lingering remnants of the past that still clung to every inch of the place. It was damaged, broken, but it wasn't beyond saving. Neither was I. I stood in the living room, looking around, remembering everything this house had once been, everything it could be again. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace settle in my chest, something steady, something real. This was my home. It had always been my home, and now, finally, it was mine again, and they would never step foot in it again.